what I'm going to show you is really a talk that I've done with a couple of different student groups at sort of university settings, where I'm not addressing specialist audiences, as it were, but a general audience, but trying to do that in such a way that I have some nuggets of real sort of philosophical rigor about some of the things that I'm doing, but I'm also trying to cover quite a lot of wide sort of territory. So I'm trying to be introductory and simple without being simplistic, and give students the idea that actually, gosh, there is some sort of depths to be plumbed here, and hopefully there'll be some nuggets of the different sort of bits that I'm drawing together that'll be of interest to various of you. So is Christianity unscientific? And indeed, why would we worry about this as an issue anyway? Well, this is new atheist Sam Harris, and I think this is a fascinating quotation from him. He's talking about James Watson, of course half a pairing of Watson and Crick, who elucidated the double helix structure of DNA, and Francis Collins, a Christian scientist in the States. And Sam Harris says this, that James Watson, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, a Nobel laureate, and the original head of the Human Genome Project, recently asserted in an interview that people of African descent appear to be innately less intelligent than white Europeans. A few sentences spoken off the cuff resulted in academic defenestration. It caused quite a stink and got into the papers and so on. I believe that a speaking engagement that he was going to be doing in England got cancelled because of these comments. Sam Harris says this, Watson's opinions on race are disturbing, but his underlying point was not in principle unscientific. I've highlighted this term. There is at least a possible scientific basis for his views. While Watson's statement was obnoxious, one cannot say that his views are utterly irrational, or that by merely giving voice to them, he's repudiated the scientific worldview, which would obviously be a bad thing, and declared himself immune to its further discoveries. Such a distinction would have to be reserved for Watson's successor at the Human Genome Project, Dr. Francis Collins. Why? Because Collins is a Bible-believing Christian. I mean, good grief. Collins believes that Jesus actually came back from the dead. You can't have such a person running the National Institute of Health, as he now does in America. This is really worrying to Sam Harris. So you see here, there's this sort of rhetorical attack upon Christianity as being unscientific, repudiating the scientific worldview and so on, that basically ranks being a Christian as being subpar, as it were, when compared to being a racist. That's the kind of depth of the rhetorical critique here. Well, is Harris right? Hey, this is where, as a philosopher, we get to say, well, that depends on what you mean by. So here are some distinctions. Woohoo! What do you mean by science? I'm going to venture where, angels fear to tread here, because, of course, this is a very controversial topic within philosophy of science. Can you even define science? And by contrast, what would it therefore mean for something to be unscientific? And what do you mean by Christianity? We have to sort of settle some definitions here. Even to point this out is at least to say that the sort of neo-atheist Christianity is unscientific critique has a certain sort of woolliness or vagueness about it that is worth noting. So, here we go. What is science? Well, of course, just etymologically, it goes back to the Latin scientia, meaning knowledge or a field of knowledge. But today we use science in a much narrower sense. Very few people would naturally speak of theology as a science, as Thomas Aquinas would have done, for example. So we use science in a narrower sense than knowledge, but scientism, as opposed to science, scientism illegitimately ignores this fact. And you may have noticed that scientism has actually been on the rise, at least in the sort of popular public debate about God and science and so on. Here's Peter Atkins, atheist chemist from the UK, from Oxford Uni. His recent book on being, he says this: the scientific method is the only means of discovering the nature of reality, the only way of acquiring reliable knowledge. Or Stephen Hawking, in his recent book, The Grand Design. He's got a wonderful publicist. He made front page news on both sides of the pond, as we call it. They start their book saying philosophy is dead. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. So this sort of public proclamation of scientism by world-class scientists at leading universities is on the rise. As Professor John Lennox, a Christian philosopher of science also from Oxford, puts it, Hawking's statement about philosophy is dead, is itself a philosophical statement. It's not a statement of science, it's a metaphysical statement about science. Therefore, his statement of philosophy is dead contradicts itself, and it doesn't get worse than self-contradiction in terms of the philosophical stakes. So this is a classic example of logical incoherence, and you know, students are just imbibed with this kind of scientific approach to knowledge. I find it amongst the A-level students that I do school conferences with. They have just never met a critique of that sort of hardline scientism. I would also say, and here again I venture into controversial territory, beware of methodological naturalism. It was Paul de Vere who distinguished between methodological naturalism as a disciplinary method or approach that's neutral concerning God's existence or non-existence, and metaphysical naturalism as the kind of actual worldview of naturalism that does deny the existence of a God. He states the natural sciences are committed to the systematic analysis of matter and energy within the context of methodological naturalism. That's just what science is. Or Nancy Murphy says science qua science seeks naturalistic explanations. If you attribute characteristics of, say, living things to a creative intelligence, by definition you're stepping outside of science into some other subject. Some other subject that's probably less well thought of as a purveyor of knowledge, given the pervasive naturalism, scientism of the culture. But I would say that if methodological naturalism even is part of the definition of science, then it has a very odd effect. And here I would agree with various atheist philosophers of science who've made this observation. Supposing that Christianity claimed that the true explanation of X, fill in the gap as you like, is a miracle. But science claims that the explanation of X is wholly naturalistic. We can explain X without appeal to a miracle. Well, supposing that to be the case, they would not be contradicting each other. Those are not contradictory claims, because by definition, science isn't concerned with knowing the truth under a methodologically naturalistic definition. This is atheist philosopher of science Bradley Monton who makes this point. He says, if science really is permanently committed to methodological naturalism, it follows that the aim of science is not generating true theories. Instead, the aim of science would be something like generating the best theories that can be formulated subject to the restriction that the theories are naturalistic or are compatible with metaphysical naturalism being true. Science is better off without being shackled to methodological naturalism, he says, because we want science to be a no-hold-barred search for the truth about the world. So, approaching our definition of science and giving some warnings about what not to define it as, I would say science should not be confused with scientism, as many students will. And indeed, I think science should not be defined as methodologically naturalistic. And in that, I'm in happy company of atheists like Bradley Monton or indeed Michael Ruse or Thomas Nagel, I think, as well. So here's a stab at a definition of science, or at least the natural sciences, shall we say. Science is a first-order discipline involving systematic inquiry, the primary aim of which is to know as much as we can about physical reality. And by know, we mean to understand, to explain, and or predict. Let me just highlight a few elements of that definition. It's a first-order discipline. By that I mean questions about the nature of science, for example, are not first-order questions of science, but second-order philosophical questions about science. Say, what is science? What should its relationship be to theology or whatever? Those are not scientific questions. Those are second-order questions about science. And it's not for the scientist, qua scientist, to answer those questions. It's for the philosopher of science to answer those questions. It's focused on physical reality, understanding it, but that is not to define it in methodologically naturalistic terms. It's just saying the thing that we're trying to understand and explain is the physical world within the natural sciences. First order scientific knowledge of that physical reality doesn't, indeed can't, exclude philosophical knowledge, say, of non-physical realities. So you can't conflate science with naturalism, let alone methodological naturalism. In other words, science is neither epistemologically nor ontologically omnicompetent, which I then have to explain, because it's like philosophers, we know we do this, we love long words that mean simple things, don't we? How we know stuff, what there is, being competent at everything, okay? Science is not the only way to know anything about all there is, and it's not the be-all and end-all of academic study of reality. It doesn't even encompass every way of knowing or everything about which we could know. It just encompasses some ways of knowing about some things. Well, that's one half of the equation, if you like. What about what is Christianity? Again, controversial territory, perhaps. Let me take Acts 2:37, where this is the response of the crowds at Pentecost. And when the people heard this, the preaching of the gospel, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, "Brothers, what shall we do?" And this ties in with research that I've been doing recently about the nature of spirituality. You'll notice here that we have some beliefs. They heard the proclamation that they were saying what had happened about Jesus, what the gospel was. They were cut to the heart. They had an attitudinal response to this set of beliefs that they'd been given. And the combination of the beliefs that they had adopted and their attitudes towards them led them to behaving in a particular way. What should we do? We have beliefs, attitudes, or actions, or perhaps more memorably, your head, your heart, and your hands. That is your spirituality. A way of relating to reality, yourself, each other, the world around us, and ultimate reality, via your worldview beliefs, your attitudes, and your behaviour, your head, your heart, your hands. And of course, Jesus taught that true spirituality, because different spiritualities will fill out those categories in different ways, true spirituality is to love God with all of your head and your heart and your strength. And how do you do that properly? Well, you have to enter into a relationship with God through Jesus himself. I am the gate. So you enter into a loving, forgiven relationship with God through Jesus, and in that relationship, you are called to be a disciple, to develop your loving of God with all of your head and your heart and your hands, which will then, of course, overflow into loving your neighbour as yourself. So we get this sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop within any spirituality, including Christian spirituality. Just the references to why Jesus puts himself at the centre, not just the message that he gave, but himself as a person at the centre of that definition of Christianity. So, having done a bit of preparatory work, we can at least begin to address, in a little bit more of a systematic way, this question of, is Christianity unscientific, and why should you worry if it is? In the modern sense of the term, for something to be unscientific would merely be for it to be something besides a first-order discipline, the primary goal of which is to know as much as we can about physical reality. Okay? Well, in that sense, of course, Christianity isn't science, and in that sense, Christianity is unscientific. But so what? Is that meant to be a critique? I mean, philosophy, in that sense, is unscientific. So is art or jam. But those are great things. I'm really pleased that there's art and jam and philosophy. So what's the critique? In other words, if this accusation in the rhetoric of being unscientific is to carry any weight, we really need to understand that what's being said is not merely that Christianity is unscientific, but that it is in some sense anti-scientific. That whole thing that Harris was saying about repudiating the scientific worldview and so on. Why should you be worried that a Christian is running the NIH, etc.? So we disambiguate the concepts of being unscientific from the concept of being anti-scientific. Being anti-scientific means being in active opposition to some essential element of science. Being in active opposition to some essential element of science. And that's going to have various consequences for the debate about science and religion. For example, disagreeing with scientific theory X, again, fill in the blank as you like, disagreeing with scientific theory X doesn't make one anti-scientific. Theories, after all, can be scientific without being true, and scientists do disagree about things quite a lot of the time. That's part of the process of science. So merely the fact that you disagree with a particular scientific theory doesn't of itself necessarily entail that you're anti-scientific. Adopting an anti-scientific position may of course lead you to reject scientific theory X. But the fact that someone rejects scientific theory X doesn't prove that they have an anti-scientific position. That just doesn't follow the consequent there, of course. Rather, being anti-scientific means being committed to a position, be that a belief or an attitude or an action, in spirituality terms, that's in tension with something that unifies the participants in the scientific project when they have scientific disagreements. So what's objectionable about rejecting a scientific theory for anti-scientific reasons isn't the rejection of the scientific theory. You could do that without being anti-scientific. Rather, it's the fact that one flouts, and we could put it like this, that you flout an epistemic virtue that's bound up in the wise practice of rationality and thus of science per se. As Stuart Hackett says, science in this narrower sense can't function without employing the universal criteria of knowledge, since we're not buying into scientism. We're really talking about flouting generally applicable epistemic virtues. The charge of being unscientific, therefore, boils down to the charge that one is being irrational. So note how Harris, in the quote we started from, he slid from calling Collins's faith in principle unscientific to calling it utterly irrational. Those for him are synonymous. That one is flouting or rejecting one of all epistemic virtues, and that's the problem. And of course, if that's what having a particular religious viewpoint meant, then I think we would want to be concerned about having that particular religious viewpoint as well. So one's only options for rebutting such a charge, if the charge actually is, you are flouting an epistemic virtue, you're being irrational by being a Christian, are as follows. You could, first of all, you could try and show that one isn't flouting or rejecting the relevant purported epistemic virtue in the particular case study that's being looked at. Or, secondly, you could show that the relevant purported epistemic virtue should be limited in some way, should be qualified or perhaps overridden by some other virtue or virtues in such a way that actually it isn't flouted by one's position. That when you understand one's position, you see that the accusation that you're flouting a relevant epistemic virtue is in fact not true. By this qualifying or overriding of other relevant positions. Or third, you could show that the relevant purported epistemic virtue should actually be rejected and actually disagree with the principle that grounds the critique, as it were. Those seem to be the logically possible responses to the critique. So, for example, Occam's razor often gets talked about in this field, and there is William of Ockham having used his razor. Thank you. So we might have an objection that goes along these lines. Look, naturalism is simpler than theism. It's a much simpler view of reality. We only appeal to one kind of explanatory entity in naturalism, whereas you theists appeal to multiple kinds of explanatory entities. Well, the rebuttal here would be to say, okay, look, the virtue of simplicity, yes, that is an epistemic virtue, appealing to simplicity in our explanations, but the virtue of that simplicity is limited or overridden by the greater virtue of explanatory adequacy. That is a more important element of Occam's razor than the simplicity element of Occam's razor. So, I might suggest that the Christians should grant the unscientific status of Christianity, whilst assigning critics like Harris the burden of justifying assertions about Christianity being anti-scientific. We want, okay, to nail them down on particulars. Critics, I think, must demonstrate that Christianity necessarily flouts a genuine epistemic obligation qua being a Christian. You've got to demonstrate that Christians flout a genuine epistemic obligation qua being a Christian. In other words, we can take any critique of the Harris kind and sort of pose some questions back to it and say, look, does being a Christian really require one to reject this supposedly essential epistemic virtue? And that's notwithstanding the actual beliefs and attitudes and actions of Christian individuals or institutions. Because it's not particularly interesting to be told there are particular ways of being a Christian that would be irrational. Other than to say, well, don't be that kind of Christian then. What the Harrises of the world need is for this to be a general critique of being any type of Christian in the true sense of the term. And secondly, we can ask, well, is this accusation that's being made, is it grounded in a sound, a properly formulated, properly ranked epistemic virtue that is essential to the scientific project? Because if not, this critique just has no purchase. We want to make sure we're not merely looking at a disagreement about particular scientific theories and so on and get to this level of, well, are we being rational in terms of rejecting something essential to the scientific project, as it were? So question 1 relates to option A, there, and question 2 relates to options B and C. So the burden of proof, I would suggest, rests with the critic to establish that both criteria are fully satisfied if their objection is going to carry any weight with us. So let's look at a couple of just quick kind of case studies, as it were, different critiques, and with this kind of background formulation of the issues in mind, how one might respond to them. So here's a quote from the new atheist physicist Victor Stenger. And he says, faith means having, quote, belief in the absence of supported evidence and even in the light of contrary evidence. That's what having faith means. You don't want to do that because that's irrational. You're flouting a genuine epistemic virtue if you have faith. And of course, you can't be a Christian without having faith. That's rather central to the whole thing, isn't it? Rebuttal. Yeah, whilst science repudiates blind faith, in the teeth of at least sufficient contrary evidence, so does Christianity. In other words, the objection fails to pass criteria 1. Being a Christian doesn't actually require you to flout that epistemic virtue of not having blind faith. Because when you add the term blind to the word faith, it's not a redundant qualifier. There can be faith that's not blind faith. Or objection, from Sam Harris's quote, Christianity repudiates the scientific worldview in rejecting metaphysical naturalism. Well, yes, whilst being a Christian does entail rejecting naturalism, a commitment to naturalism isn't an essential element of science, because scientism is wrong and we don't want to conflate these things. So the objection fails because it fails to satisfy criteria 2. So one would hope, as a Christian, of course, that any critique of this kind is going to fail to carry its burden of proof with respect to one or other of the criteria, or maybe both of them. Take a little look at what we could call overlapping interests, because some put forward this view, of course, of science and religion in general, Christianity in particular, are kind of these hermetically sealed compartments. Never the twain shall meet. They just deal with different things, you know. Stephen Jay Gould famously sort of said, you know, science tells us about the way reality is, tells us about the facts of the matter, and religion is all about sort of fuzzy feelings of warmth and hope and meaning in life and so on, and you know. So they're about different things, so they don't conflict with each other. But that's because science is telling us the truth about reality and religion is sort of giving us nice feelings. Not the way I want to divide things up. Actually, I think there are overlapping interests between science and Christianity. The fact that Christianity is unscientific in that modern sense of the term we looked at doesn't mean that it's got nothing to do with science, as if they were these hermetically sealed thing. And you could say the same, of course, of philosophy and art and jam. Thomas Aquinas, who I mentioned a little earlier, who's also been using Occam's razor, calls theology the queen of the sciences, the ultimate integrating discipline of the university, assisted by her handmaiden philosophy. The area we now call science was, of course, natural philosophy. I still prefer that way of referring to it. It's a good way of irking scientists if you come across them. Well, oh, you're a natural philosopher. Yes. Taking back to our sort of grid of spirituality, Christianity and science have overlapping interests in faith's attitudes, the attitudes of our hearts towards things, the commitments that we make, and not just our feeling responses, but our choice responses as well. For example, we have overlapping interests in the nature of community. Science is a communal project, a worldwide spanning communal undertaking. You know, you have everything from your lab or your paper writing partners all the way through to everyone who reads and contributes to the journal in your area, etc., etc. Attitudes come into epistemology, particularly if you're thinking in terms of sort of virtue theory, epistemology, and so on. Or actions, how we actually do things in the world, particularly in the area of ethics, of course, the ethics of particular research methodologies. In technology and its influence upon society and people, and how we use our knowledge of reality to give power over reality, at least to some sets of people within society. Environmental concerns and so on. These should be overlapping areas of interest between science and Christianity. So there are overlapping areas of interest in terms of the hands and the heart, as well as the head, in terms of knowing the truth about empirical reality. Of course, that's not all that Christianity is interested in, but it is interested in it. Christianity is a historical religion. It does make certain truth claims about the nature of reality. These may be more or less expansive depending upon your interpretation of certain biblical passages, but at the very least, as a historical religion, the science of archaeology would be interested in certain things that Christianity is interested in as well. Or perhaps the claim that the cosmos had a beginning would be an overlapping area of interest between theology and cosmology. As J.P. Moreland from the States says, Christianity claims to be a knowledge tradition. It's not all that it is. It's our whole selves, as we saw in that diagram of spirituality, but it is no less than that, at least. It places knowledge, not merely truth, at the centre of proclamation and discipleship. It talks about the way in which the Old and New Testaments, including the teachings of Jesus, claim not merely that Christianity is true, but that a variety of its moral and religious assertions can be known to be true. Not known indubitably, necessarily, but known. Which is completely the opposite of the impression that the new atheists have been so successful in purveying to culture. We looked at this critique from Stenger already a little bit, but Dawkins, faith is blind trust in the absence of evidence, he's in the teeth of evidence. A.C. Grayling, philosopher at Oxford University, faith is a commitment to believe contrary to evidence and reason. That's just what it means. People don't even consult dictionaries these days, but that just pervades the culture. I like answering this with a quote from C.S. Lewis, just to give a quick plug to my new book, C.S. Lewis versus the New Atheists, where he defines faith as the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods, and contrasts not faith and reason, but faith on the basis of being reasonable against, say, temptations not to continue having that reasonable trust, temptations from sloth or greed or lust or whatever. Seems like new atheists just have no cognizance of passages like 1 Peter 3:15, the famous apologist's text verse, always be prepared to give an answer, an apologia, a reasoned defence to everyone who asks, etc. And again, here, once you have this structure of spirituality in mind, you start noticing that it crops up everywhere. So be prepared to give, it's something you've got to do, to give an answer, an apologia, a rational defence. And how have you got to do it? You've got to do it with, because of your hope and with gentleness and respect, which are all about the attitudes that you take, both towards God and towards the people who are asking you to justify yourself. You could split it down also in biblical terms to works and faith, saying faith is the combination of belief and attitude, that we could make the traditional philosophical distinction between belief in something and belief that something. It's one thing to believe that the chair will probably support my weight. It's quite another thing to sit on the chair. Or the traditional image of the bridge across the gorge. Yes, I believe, I've done my mechanics calculations and so on, I believe that rope bridge should take the truck. Does that mean that I'm not, when I'm approaching the bridge in my truck, going, that's a heck of a drop, going to go, go on then? No, I still have to take an attitudinal, volitional aspect to my belief, which is about belief in, not merely about the sort of abstract, merely intellectual belief that. In other words, I think that the best modern translation for faith is trust. All of the standard epistemic virtues that would attach to belief that do not simply get sort of chucked out and left by the wayside because you're combining it with belief in. That would be completely unnecessary. And of course, everyone, including scientists, exercise trust. And they don't exercise that trust in an irrational manner, necessarily. They exercise a rationally grounded trust on a daily basis. And they exercise a rationally grounded trust on a daily basis to do their work as scientists. You have to trust that people are accurately reporting the results of their experiments when they publish it in the paper and not defrauding you. Sometimes they do, and so on. So far from seeing any grounds for any kind of strong critique saying Christianity is unscientific or indeed anti-scientific, that there's a contradiction between the two, not only is there a coherence, I would argue, but given the overlapping interests of Christianity and science, I would actually want to argue for at least a partial consonance between the two, not merely a lack of contradiction, but a mutually supporting relationship. In each of the instances where science and Christianity have an overlapping interest in the nature of reality, you can ask, of course, are these differing perspectives, as it were, incompatible, apparently, or compatible? If it's apparently incompatibility is there, is that because science, or because Christian theology, or because both are wrong in this instance? Maybe the particular scientific theory is wrong, but maybe the particular theological theory or interpretation is wrong. Or maybe they're both wrong. And I was also say with a good point that Alvin Plantinga, I think, makes, is that if there's an apparent contradiction between theology and science, one shouldn't automatically assume that it's science that's going to triumph, is going to be the trump card in the debate between the two. If there's an apparent conflict, maybe the rational warrant of the theological position is stronger than the rational warrant of the particular scientific position. Because remember, saying that scientific theory is wrong is not being anti-scientific. Indeed, you need to be able to say that sometimes in order to be scientific and make progress in science. And since we have these overlapping interests between these two disciplines, and since Christianity is not less than a knowledge tradition, in any case of apparent conflict, one does, of course, have to play the weighing up the reasons one against the other. So one or other or both might be wrong. But if there's no apparent incompatibility, there is at least an apparent compatibility. But there again, we might divide that into mere coherence, as it were, a lack of conflict. There doesn't seem to be any apparent conflict between the doctrine of the Trinity and the chemistry of rusting. I don't see any conflict between those. But is that a mere coherence between these truth claims and knowledge traditions? Or is there, perhaps, at least on occasion, a consonance, the presence of support, whether that's mutual or in either direction between the subjects, as it were? So this is again, you can see a way in which this talk is throwing out quite a lot of little tidbits to the audience, because I'm expecting particular comebacks from the kind of audiences that I normally do this with, but just some quotes about this idea of the historic warfare between science and religion having been debunked by recent work in the history of science. When we get on to the question of how do we explain science itself, I think there we have our best grounds for arguing for a consonance between Christianity and science. And here's a fascinating, quite long, but I think very fascinating quote from Dr. Paul Davies, who's quite a well-known public writer, theoretical physicist, and an agnostic. But he says this, he says, the worldview of a scientist, even the most atheistic scientist, is that essentially of monotheism. It is a belief which is accepted as an article of faith that the universe is ordered in an intelligible way. Now, you couldn't be a scientist if you didn't believe these two things. If you didn't think there was an underlying order in nature, you wouldn't bother to do science, because there's nothing to be found. And if you didn't believe it was intelligible, that you could find it, you'd give up, because there's no point if human beings can't come to understand it. But scientists do, as a matter of faith, accept that the universe is ordered and at least partially intelligible to human beings. And that's what underpins the entire scientific enterprise. And Paul Davies, as an agnostic, says, and that is a theological position. It's absolutely clear when you look at history that it comes from a theological worldview. And it's very, very significant that in historical terms that's where it comes from, and that scientists unshakably today retain that worldview as an act of faith. And scientists just take this for granted for the most part, but I think it's a really important point that needs to be made. What a fascinating quote to get from a working agnostic scientist. I think there are various philosophical presuppositions of science, and pointing these out is of course one of the ways of undermining scientism, various philosophical presuppositions of science that are actually warranted by at least some general form of theism, so that one needn't hold these presuppositions of science that Davies was pointing towards as an act of blind faith, but that actually combining science with theism means that the scientific enterprise becomes something that is a rationally warranted exercise. Some of these Davies has mentioned, others are not. Maybe the assumption that the natural world exhibits a rational order, that the human mind to some degree is able to understand that rational order, that human cognitive and sensory faculties are at least generally reliable more often than not, that the rational order displayed by the natural world can't be just deduced from first principles, like Aristotle kind of sitting in his armchair thinking, how must planets go? They must go in circles, mustn't they, obviously, because circles are the perfect shape. So that's how planets must go. Rather, as the founders of the scientific enterprise did, they said, okay, however planets go, there must be a rational structure to it that we can understand, but God, who created the universe, has free will, so maybe he had a range of rational options, and we can't just dictate from first principles which of those he chose with his free will, so perhaps we better get a telescope and go and point it at a planet and see what it actually does. Oh look, it goes in an elliptical orbit. Okay? That there are knowable objective values, truth, goodness, beauty. You should be honest in your research. Beauty as a very significant epistemic virtue, particularly within various sort of cosmological quantum theory and kind of thing. You often get physicists appealing to the beauty of the mathematics of a particular theory as a point in its favour, interestingly. That the natural world is not itself divine. So when you're chopping up the frog to understand how it works, you're not dissecting God. You're not meddling in things that man was not meant to know. This kind of phrase from the 50s movies, That actually, no, we are meant to, according to the creation story, we are meant to study and understand and know in order to better look after and steward the world. It's given to us by God, created by God, but it is not God. Maybe the assumption that the natural world isn't governed by multiple competing and or capricious forces, as various polytheistic views would say. If they're capricious, there's no order there for us to understand. If they're competing with one another, there's no underlying unified order. Rather, there's these sort of differing camps and sides to nature. So these might be some of the kind of presuppositions of science that can be warranted by a monotheistic view of reality, rather than taking these as acts of blind faith, as Paul Davies says scientists do. One last interesting quote, this is from Steve Fuller, from a few years ago now. Steve Fuller is a very interesting academic in the UK. He's a sociologist of science. He's sort of very influential within the whole discipline of the sociology of science, the sociology of knowledge. And he says this, he says, while I cannot honestly say that I believe in a divine personal creator, no plausible alternative has yet been offered to justify the pursuit of science as a search for the ultimate systematic understanding of reality. Atheism as a positive doctrine has done precious little for science. It's quite the reverse view to the view that many undergraduate and A-level students that I meet will hold. He goes on and says, science makes sense only if there's an overall design to nature that we are especially well equipped to fathom, even though most of it has little bearing on our day-to-day animal survival. And of course we could get sidetracked here into the whole fascinating debate about the argument from reason and Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary anti-naturalism argument, and all the way back through C.S. Lewis and his forebears and so on. Humanity's creation in the image of God, says Fuller, provides the clearest historical rationale for the rather specialised expenditure of effort associated with science. This is a charming medieval painting of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with God. And of course, some Christians take this more literally than others. But all Christians agree with some of the theological, metaphysical points that this story tells us. Not only is there a rational God with free will who created a universe which therefore reflects both his creative freedom and his rationality, and indeed, I would want to say his beauty, and so on. But that God, within Christianity, is thought to have created humanity, male and female, in his image. That image is, of course, not physical, but spiritual, and is primarily related to the things that make us persons in relationship with each other, with the creation, with God, in our whole selves, our spirituality, in our head, our hearts, and our hands. And that means that we not only expect to be able to understand something of the nature of God, we can't expect to comprehend our Creator, but we can expect reasonably to understand something, to know something of him, but also that when we turn our attention to the world that he's created, we can expect to understand something of the rationality that's out there. Because the way we think about things in here, as it were, and the way things are out there, both come from the same self-consistent source. They come from the same place, so we expect them a priori to fit together. And that is the kind of view of reality that sparked the scientific revolution, that agnostics like Paul Davies and Fuller still point to as at least a rational grounding for what is otherwise an act of blind faith in doing science. So that actually there is a consonance between at least a theistic view of reality and science, that theism justifies science, far from it being the case that science justifies atheism. It is theism that justifies science. And so that makes it rather hard to use science as a stick with which to beat theism. So is Christianity unscientific? Well, yes. in that Christianity isn't science. But so what? No, in that Christianity is not demonstrably anti-science. No, in that science isn't epistemologically or ontologically omnicompetent. No, in that Christianity is a knowledge tradition. No, in that Christianity helped give birth to science. No, in that theism provides metaphysical warrant for the scientific project.